Good day. I'm Andrea Spindle. Welcome to the latest Web Talk series, Truth Must Be Told, Lies Fuel Contemporary Anti-Semitism. I'm sure that everyone on this webinar will agree with that latter statement. Today's guest speaker will address how lies coming from Jewish organizations and prominent individuals, both in Israel and in the diaspora, are contributing to anti-Semitism and endangering Jews. This is adding a new dimension to anti-Semitism, whether inadvertently or maybe in some cases intentionally. First, let me remind you that the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation is a federally registered Canadian NGO, and donations are eligible for a tax receipt. You can support our work online at www.caef.ca, and American donations are processed by our partner, the Lawfare Project, so are also eligible for a tax receipt. CAEF presents informative expert webinars, a regular bulletin of collated stories about advocacy and action at the local level. We work collaboratively with many Jewish and non-Jewish organizations, and for today's webinar, I'm very pleased to acknowledge and thank our many co-sponsors. This includes Americans for a Safe Israel, the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, the Israel Action Committee of East Bay, End Jew Hatred Canada, the Israel Committee of Sonoma County, the Larger Center Congregation, the Lawfare Project, the Bedin Center for Near East Policy Research, the North Carolina Coalition for Israel, European Lawyers for Israel, the Zionist Organization of America, the Israel Independence Fund, Eye on Anti-Semitism, Regavim, the Kud UK, Beth Tikva Synagogue, the Israel Defense and Security Forum, the Matthias Project, and of course, Im Tirtzu. This is an extensive and diverse group of Zionist organizations, all concerned with the welfare of the Jewish state, all addressing current levels of anti-Semitism and collectively educating Jews and non-Jews about the truth. I invite you to use these organizations as resources in your own search for truth and as references when confronting others who are ignorant or confused, but willing to learn the truth about Israel. Today's speaker, Douglas Altabef, is an individual who sought the truth and became empowered by it, giving his full attention now to helping Jewish NGOs to develop and extend their reach. Prior to making Aliyah with his family in 2009, Doug was the principal of a money management firm in New York, and he continued to work with the company from Israel until 2014. He is mission-driven, and since 2014 has been the chair of Im Tirtzu and serves on the board of the Israel Independence Fund. Doug writes for several English language media, such as the Jerusalem Post, the Jewish News Syndicate, and Arutz Sheva, and gives extensive interviews on current events in Israel. Doug is a graduate from Columbia College and Harvard Law School. As a volunteer, Doug is working to strengthen the Zionist Dream and through Im Tirtzu to raise awareness of the many threats facing Israel. Today, he will speak about the protests you've all seen or read about. His topic, Protesting the Protesters, is democracy really under threat in Israel? And I hope this will assuage you of any serious concerns. After his presentation, Doug will take a few questions from the audience. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. Please use the chat only respectfully in communicating with one another. And feel free to tell us where you are joining us from today. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you and welcome everyone. And I want to start by thanking CAEF and Andrea in particular for conceiving and organizing this presentation. As we all know, CAEF has been a stalwart force in the fight against anti-Semitism and in shining the light of understanding of the beneficial impact of Israel, and we all wish them continued success and strength. I also, like Andrea, want to thank the many organizations that have lent their support for tonight's discussion, which clearly should tell us how concerned, engaged, and focused so many of us are and need to be on the health and welfare of our beloved Israel. And on one personal note, I just apologize in advance. I have a bit of a cold. It's not COVID, it's just cold. Remember colds? People used to get colds. And so if I sound a little, whatever, you'll know why. But friends, unless you have been in an ashram for the last month or so, you know that Israel has a new government. Now, before we move on from this fairly straightforward observation, I think it is worthy of comment. Israel has had two indecisive elections in 2019, neither of which resulted in a forthcoming government. There followed two short-lived governments, the latter of which was a coalition of disparate parties ranging from Naftali Bennett's Jewish Home Party on the right, all the way over to the far left Meretz Party on the left, featuring also the Mansour Abbas's Ram Party, the party of the Southern Islamic movement, and a mix in between. Bennett was the prime minister for about a year, replaced by Yesh Atid chairman Yair Lapid after the government proved to be unsustainable. There was much too much of an ideological pull to the left. The 10th man in the minion, so to speak, was an Arab party with its own particular demands and needs. And as they say, the center could not hold. So you had a unifying factor in this coalition, and that factor was hatred of the once and future prime minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu. But that obviously did not prove to be enough. There was a recent election, and which saw for the first time in 5 a far more cohesive coalition, and one with something a bit more than a razor-thin parliamentary majority. So this was a big event. For the right, it was a moment of vindication as Prime Minister Netanyahu was returned to power as the longest-serving prime minister in Israeli history, and one of the longest-serving in any Western democracy in the past century. For the opposition, though, this was a nightmarish deja vu, one really partially of their own creation. They ran a poor and uncoordinated race. For example, the far-left Meretz Party did not even cross the electoral threshold. All these factors would have been sufficient in and of themselves to depress and even to enrage the left. But the crowning humiliation was that the coalition partners of Netanyahu's eclectic Likud party were all religious parties, the religious Zionist party and two Haredi parties, Shas, the party of Mizrahim and Sfardim, and UTJ, the party of Ashkenazim. Now, to the secular left-wing opposition, this is a nightmarish prospect of course, a theocratic governing coalition, and the fear, phobia, and panic of the opposition rose dramatically. But that wasn't all of it. That wasn't even the worst of it. The worst was that one of the most visible and influential candidates in this race was none other than Itamar Ben-Gvir of the Otzma Yehudit party. Ben-Gvir, running together with Bezalel Smotrich, was able to almost double their representation from the previous election. And this, of course, is highly instructional. It says a lot. And it also threw the opposition into paroxysms of despair and, of course, aggressive demonization. Now, for the left, Ben-Gvir was the ultimate boogeyman, the man who would bring authoritarianism to Israel, the man who would subvert democracy with his Kahanist principles and his willingness to deport anyone and everyone who thought differently from himself. It bears mentioning why the right won as handily as it did and why Ben-Gvir and Smotrich did as well as they did. And the answer to this, I believe, is closely related to the question of how real or actual threats are, threats to democracy are here in Israel today. The simple answer to the question of why the right won is that people were scared. People were fed up. They were frightened by the increasing lawlessness and violence of our society, by the sense that there was no consistent application of the law across the board, and by a fear in the name of containing problems that we had been putting a lid on them and we were compromising on our sovereignty and our control of our society. By the way, Ben Gvir's vote increased proportionally in left-wing areas such as Tel Aviv and its surrounding suburbs. In other words, the vote for him there also doubled. And it did also in the Arab communities, because many Arabs have been pushing very hard for stricter and stronger law enforcement. So whether it was illegal land usurpations in the Negev and in Area C of Judea and Samaria, or the lack of effective police response to the mixed riots that we had in 2021, or the unopposed constant financing by European governments of illegal Palestinian construction in Area C, more and more Israelis thought that their country was slipping away from them, and that the government charged with creating order and across the board respect for the rule of law was failing the people. Now, the new coalition parties were very vocal, and this is important in terms of where we are today. They were very vocal about their desire to tackle long-festering domestic problems. And one reason why they're very vocal about it is because, frankly, Prime Minister Netanyahu's focus has historically been very, very largely outward. His overwhelming interest concern confronting Iran and building and enhancing international relations for the state of Israel. And at that, he has been peerless. He has been brilliant. He has been masterful. In terms of his domestic priorities, overwhelmingly, his focus has been on initially deregulating and then stimulating and supporting the Israeli economy. And there too, he has a great many successes that he can point to. But frankly, on a number of other domestic issues, he's basically been a no-show, or to put it more charitably, he's acted very incrementally in the classic posture of an Edmund Burkean conservative who wants to tinker around the edges of an issue rather than to take it on wholesale. And that is where the other coalition parties not only rushed into the breach to comprehensively address existing problems, but also use those very issues as their leverage for their willingness to join the new government. So while the perception of being a new sheriff in town was very helpful to Ben Gvir personally, for the others in the coalition, there was also the strong message that festering problems were demanding attention and hopefully solution. Now, perhaps the most talked about of these festering issues for several years now has been the breathtaking overreach and accumulation of unchecked power by the Israeli Supreme Court. And sure enough, it has been this issue that more than any has been the line drawn, the gauntlet thrown as between supporters and opponents of the government. It has become the embodiment of a great deal of the fault lines and the underlying divides of our country. It's been an issue, interestingly, that has pretty much united the right across the board and has also, over the years, attracted quite a bit of support from the center, even the center left. Although you won't hear that today because of the difference in political affiliations. For example, Gideon Sa'ar, who's in the opposition today, was a leading advocate for judicial reform for many, many years, but policy identifications here are often trumped by political affiliations, and that certainly has been the case with him, as well as some others. Rest assured that most people who are expressing passionate feelings defending the Supreme Court have very little understanding of the structural issues as to how the court functions, its use of its very broad discretionary criteria as to the cases that it will hear, its willingness to confront the Knesset, its makeup, and of course, its very own selection process. Few, if any, of these issues are known to the tens of thousands who turn up to insist that tinkering with the Supreme Court is the greatest threat to Israeli democracy since what? Since, I would suggest, the election of Menachem Begin in 1977. Now, my reference to Begin's election is not facetious, but it's meant to convey the exact same emotion that existed then, that somehow the country was about to be lost. After all, here was Begin, the arch terrorist, the planner of the bombing of the King David Hotel, the arch foe of David Ben-Gurion. How could he possibly be a steward of democracy? How could he possibly? Of course, we know the history and we know the reality. But we need to understand that the emotions sending people out to protest are really about one primary thing, and that is power. Power and the potential loss thereof. The current Supreme Court, ironically, greatly resembles ruling coalitions of pre-Begin Israel, Ashkenaz, leftist, and largely secular. They are not a cross-section of the country as it is today. Like the pre-Begin governments, they strongly tilt to the left. They express their leftist orientation in a full-throttled support and defense of minority rights, to the point of providing far greater leniency and discretion to the acts of Arabs, including Arabs appropriating land or killing Jews, than they do to the Jewish majority. To my way of thinking, this is the legal version of virtue signaling. The Supreme Court is broadcasting its virtuosity by a deliberate embrace of minority rights and a deliberate derogation of the majority will. Now, look, the left has more or less lost control of the Knesset. So the Supreme Court represents their one great remaining lever of power. And losing the court, so to speak, would relegate them to secondary levers of power, which they totally control: culture, academia, media, high-tech world. They're significant, but they're not the political gold standard. And the left here, as it is in most places, wants all the control. They want to be like pre-Begin Israel, run by an old boy network of the Israeli version of WASPs, white, Ashkenaz, secular, Poalim, meaning Labor Party. That's what they want. They want to control all the levers of power. So they will fight to the bitter end for keeping the Supreme Court just as it is now, when even presented with all the facts, they really can't defend it, but they will defend it. So that's where that sits. Let's put these emotions to the side for a moment and take a realistic view at what this new government represents. I want to suggest that fears about them are overwrought. They're overwrought because, like their spiritual forebear Menachem Begin, I believe that the new leaders are planning to govern consistent with the Zionist playbook. And what do I mean by that? I mean that there is no desire to subvert Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. I believe that they do not have any interest in a theocracy, nor of denying civil rights to any minorities or those who disagree with them. It's really not in the cards. They're not interested in repressing women. They're not interested in repressing gays. What they do represent, and this is part of the big divide about the Supreme Court, is a renewed respect for the rights of the majority, a group definitely prejudiced by the mindset and policies of the Supreme Court. Whether it is beleaguered Jewish farmers in the Negev or Judea and Samaria, or embattled residents of South Tel Aviv threatened by illegal immigrants, or the bereaved families of terror who have to go to scrape together funds to go to court and be confronted by teams of lawyers paid for by European governments defending terrorists. The new government understands that your regular Israeli citizen has been a second-class citizen in the eyes of the Supreme Court. Now, look, this is not the place for a lengthy tutorial on the machinations of the Supreme Court and how they have become by far the most powerful and least accountable branch of government in Israel. But certain things need to be pointed out. The court today is the product of a self-described revolution that began in 1995 under Supreme Court President Aharon Barak, and which was intended to greatly increase the scope of the cases that the court could hear and opine on, and on the breadth, the scope, and the rulings, judgments, and orders that they could prescribe. Now, we all learned in school that sound democratic governance requires checks and balances in order to prevent one branch from overlording over the others. But there have been no checks and balances on the judiciary. And what its supporters call an independent judiciary is actually an unaccountable or an unrestrained judiciary. What I have found disheartening is the complete refusal of those defending the Supreme Court to acknowledge that there might be legitimacy to the complaints of the new ministers seeking change, and that certain facets of the court's mandate or its powers should be open for review and negotiation. Instead, there has been an iron wall, a mantra-like insistence that tampering, touching, or questioning anything having to do with the court is tantamount to threatening Israeli democracy. This stance even comes from the president of the Supreme Court herself, who has been the opposite of judicious in her defense of her court. There's been no shortage of attempted intimidation by a visible, vocal, and emotional campaign intended to scare the rest of us against the idea of reforming the court's power and prerogatives. The court's defenders have turned to allies in high tech and finance, all of whom are happy to opine about the decline of Israel if anything happens to the Supreme Court. What I worry about is that the issue of the Supreme Court, of course, is very much a political issue, but it's wrapped around jurisprudential principles. And one would hope that those principles could be addressed in a way that they could be made to be enduring and acceptable to future governments, so that we're not in a ping pong game where one government comes in and one way of looking at justice goes out, and vice versa when the new government takes over. That would be difficult. But let's face it, this is ultimately a political negotiation. And I believe, and I hope, it will be thrashed out like many political disagreements, ultimately with an agreed upon solution. But I believe that the only way to get to that point of solution is for the government to continue to assert the imbalance and the unfairness, and yes, the undemocratic nature of the current situation, and to insist on the package of reforms. This will be a major conflict of visions, but ultimately neither side should want to send the country into a tailspin in order to win their argument. Now, let's turn to some of the other issues that the new government is looking to address. And here I think we see more consensual opportunities for improvement. One reason Andrea asked me, and not some of my more astute political commentator friends, to address the topic of the new government, is that I am privileged to be the longtime chairman of the board of the most visible, and I would suggest most impactful, advocate for and defender of Zionism in Israel, and that organization is Im Tirtzu. Im Tirtzu has long been focused on many of the issues that have slid or have been ignored in our country. And we are hopeful that with this new government, these issues will receive the attention that they deserve. Now, just by way of background, for those of you who don't know us, our name comes from Theodor Herzl's famous statement, Im Tirtzu zu lo agada. If you will it, Im Tirtzu, it is no dream. Herzl, of course, was referring to the idea of a Jewish state. And we took the name because, to our way of thinking, the reality of continuing to will the Jewish state is needed and is a never-ending effort. So we think that the name had value, great inspirational value then and great relevance today. Our origins stem from the days following the 2006 Lebanon War, when soldiers returning to their classrooms at Hebrew University in Jerusalem were being told that the army that they had just fought in was committing war crimes, and the country that they had just defended was a colonialist occupying power. Okay, this is 2006, and this is within Israel. Needless to say, this engendered a pushback, and the pushback went national. And today, Im Tirtzu is the largest grassroots Zionist organization in Israel, with some 20 branches on campuses throughout the country, where every year hundreds, thousands of volunteer activists participate in one or more of our activities. We've also become very active and visible in our Knesset, where we've been instrumental in urging the formation of caucuses to consider important issues, and where, based on our research, we have been able to suggest and inspire pieces of legislation. In the current government, we have already inspired legislation based on some of our more prominent campaigns. One of our longest standing campaigns has been to call out the toxic connection between European governments and NGOs associated with those governments and anti-Israel Israeli organizations who receive the bulk of their funding from these foreign governmental sources. In a previous Knesset, we encouraged the passage of a transparency law in which organizations which receive the majority of their funding from foreign governments are required to disclose that, similar to the Foreign Agent Act, Disclosure Act in the United States. Now, in the current government, we have suggested two pieces of legislation. One that would prohibit donations from countries that Israel has no diplomatic relations with to any NGOs in Israel. In other words, Qatar cannot fund organizations here. The second would deny tax-exempt status to any organization that receives the bulk of its funding from one or more foreign organizations. Those bills are currently making their way through the Knesset. Foreign governments have also been very active in financing illegal Palestinian Arab construction in Area C of Judea and Samaria. And we have adopted the proactive posture of protecting Jewish farms and farmers, not only in Area C, but also in the Negev, through what I call strategic tree planting. We recently undertook two crowdfunding campaigns that will now enable us to plant thousands of young fruit trees as buffers, as lines of demarcation, other ways to fill Jewish farms so as to discourage illegal land seizures by having Arabs or Bedouins plant on these lands and then claim them as their own, something that has happened all too often. Interestingly, we recently did a large tree planting in an area of the Negev in which trees previously planted by Kakal, KKL, known in the diaspora as the JNF, were uprooted by Bedouins who were upset that anyone besides Bedouins would be planting anywhere in the Negev, since they believe they now control it. That's one of the festering problems. Because of that uprooting, Kakal announced that they were suspending tree planting. in that area. Well, we went there with a lot of trees, and we brought a lot of activists, and we brought 2 members of the Knesset, and we planted trees in the same area without incident. And hours after we finished, Kakal announced that they would resume tree planting in that area. Another theme of ours has been our soldiers, both for expressing our appreciation for them and even protecting them from harassment. In one case, a few years ago, 2 soldiers independently came into our office and said they had been denied service in a restaurant because they were in uniform. Now, we had a hard time believing this. We verified it, and once we realized that it actually had happened, we took the news to a friend in the Knesset, and within weeks, legislation was passed that made it illegal to deny service to a soldier in uniform in any public accommodation. In this new government, an MK has sponsored legislation based on our experience with one of our great initiatives called Filming the Filmers. Over the years, hundreds of anarchists and activists have gathered at checkpoints, at guard stations, and other sensitive locations to harass IDF soldiers. How do they do this? Well, they stand literally inches away from the soldier, holding up a smartphone to his face, filming him and yelling at him, accusing him or her of war crimes, for example. Of course, what they're hoping to get is a reaction, so they can upload the reaction and show the world how vicious our soldiers really are. So what we've been doing is sending our activists to these same locations, and they film the bad guys. They film the filmers, and they also yell at them, and they tell them to leave our soldiers alone and to go home. And this has been quite successful, and particularly in Hebron, where we were able to have one very prominent anti-Israel organization debark, leave because of our activities. Now, an MK is sponsoring legislation that will ban the filming of soldiers within an intimate distance from the filming of soldiers within an intimate distance of the soldier. And hopefully it passes and takes some very unnecessary pressure off our soldiers. There are many other initiatives we're involved with, but I want to just give you a sense of what we're hoping to accomplish. Quite simply, Im Tirtzu seeks to walk the Zionist walk as well as talk the Zionist talk. In sum, our strong view, of course, is that the new government is the product of an energetic, some would say hyperkinetic democracy, not the lack of a democracy. And our new leaders, religious or otherwise, are not looking to subvert democracy or install a theocracy or deny people their rights. Many of our leaders know what it is like to be biased against, and they're not looking to lash out in reciprocity nor revenge. Ariel Sharon, when he became prime minister, he said, "What I see from here, you cannot see from there." In other words, there are pressures and also perspectives that leaders have that the rest of us might not fully appreciate. Those who demonize the likes of a Ben Gvir as an extremist fail to understand that as he has said on numerous occasions, I have aged, I have matured, I have changed. If approached with an open mind, this government will have the potential to surprise a great many people with how Zionist, democratic, and impactful it might actually turn out to be. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your forbearance. And now I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Doug. That was great. You've given us a tremendous overview and understanding of the issues and perspectives. So thank you so very much. And I'm sorry you have a bad cold, but thank you for hanging in. There have been a number of questions coming in. I'm going to start with a few of my own. Canada, and I'm not sure about the US, there have been vigils. We would call them protests. They call them vigils. Therefore, I consider the participants really are vigilantes standing outside the Israeli embassy, protesting. I'm not sure how you protest a recently elected government, but protesting some of the proposals that you've just outlined. And of course, screaming about 2 or 3 MKs that they consider dangerous, used even words of criminality. Some of the people who have led this are rabbis. I'm wondering if you're aware of that, if you have any comments on the role that rabbis are playing and any particular denominations of Judaism in leading all of this activity.
Yeah, I am aware of that. Look, there is a lot of heat and very little light in these protests, meaning, as I said in my remarks about the court, most people have no idea what the issues really are. Most people, hear a buzz term. They see that once upon a time, when he was 19 years old, Ben-Gvir was a Kahanist. Ben-Gvir is 46 years old. He's a minister in the government. He is not the same person he was, 25, 30 years ago, before. I remember when I was in college, there was a guy, Bill Ayers. He was a terrorist with the Weather Underground. And today he's regarded as a guru of the Democratic Party. Angela Davis was a revolutionary when I was in college. And she's one of the gray-haired eminences of progressivism. In other words, they were allowed to mature. They were allowed to evolve. Ben-Gvir is not being allowed to evolve. And I think that that's a tremendous lack of charity on the part of protesters. I think it betrays a tremendous lack of understanding as to what leadership is about. One does not become the leader of a democratic country in order to thwart, sink, or ruin that democracy. One becomes a leader of democratic Israel to cherish that democracy, to build it and to extol it. So I believe that their bona fides, their desires, their goals are very, very good and pure. As far as, I do not want to get into you start shooting in the tent about intra-Jewish stuff, but it is depressing to see that a great many Jews in the diaspora, and there are some in Israel too, who are prioritizing their political beliefs over their Jewish peoplehood. Let's just put it that way. And I don't know that that's necessarily denominational specific, but I think it does certainly skew to the more progressive Jews among us.
Do you see a coalition of support for the government doing any demonstrations or making itself heard? Because we're not seeing that here. I'm pretty sure Im Tirtzu must partner with other organizations within Israel. Is there any movement there that one will identify as standing with the government, or at least standing for the democracy and suggesting the protests go home?
Yes, there are a lot of people standing with the government. But they are not necessarily on the barricades. In fact, one of the issues, and this is very unsettling, my organization, as I talked about, has a very long history in academia, on campuses, in confronting anti-Zionism on campuses. And one of the things that we're seeing today is intimidation of students who want to support the government, who want to support Supreme Court reform. They are being intimidated in classrooms by professors who are threatening them in terms of how they're going to do in their course, their future prospects as students. This thing goes on all the time in the classroom. And now it's becoming particularly ugly. And so, yes, there is a desire there are many people on both sides of this equation. The left has rallied people literally for very visible protests. By the way, those protests are largely American financed
I was going to ask
by
that.
the New Israel Fund, by the Open Society Foundation. This is an attempt to bring those kinds of strategies and tactics that have been used a lot in America to Israel. And there has been, so that has gone on fairly extensively, but the right tends not to be as demonstrative, as vocal as the left is. And here, I think that it's fair to say that a lot of the intensity of the left is driven by the idea that they can't abide the idea of somehow losing their Supreme Court. That's a very dangerous prospect.
I think
So that any negotiation, any compromise is tantamount to loss. And so it is you hear terms that you've never heard in this country before. We've got to go to the barricades. We have to disrupt civil society. We have to do things that are very, very unlike what we are used to seeing here.
it's consistent with a lot of what what we'll be talking about next week, which is wokeism, which is a leftist cultish behavior. You've spoken a lot about academia, which is the same problem in North America. What about media? Is the media driving this a bit in Israel as well? Do you have any media countering it?
Yes, I mean, I think if you talk to the leaders of the reform campaign, they would say that the media has been very biased. The media in Israel is pretty biased. You now have one TV station, which actually Yair Lapid tried to shut down, Channel 14, which is conservative oriented. But yes, it's highly biased. Media, academia, culture are very heavily leftist infused. It's always been that way, probably will always be that way. And it makes it very hard to get the message out, the reality out, when there are so many easy buzz terms, so many easy, associations that one can make that make any attempt at an issues-oriented conversation seem, pointless.
Is there going to be some level of consultation? I had read an article, and I can't find it to bring forward, that Netanyahu was actually going to have some consultative process around the judicial reforms. Is that not the case? Well,
I think ultimately there'll be a lot of consultation, because no one wants this to become a standoff. The nightmare scenario is the Knesset passes certain laws disallowing the Supreme Court to overrule legislation, and the court knocks it down as being unconstitutional. And then who do you have the proverbial standoff where the Knesset says one thing, the court says another thing, and we don't want to get to that point. So I think consultations, negotiations will inevitably take place, but I think that it's very important for the reformers to make sure that people are understanding that this is not coming from nowhere. This is not a situation where, as I said in my remarks, if the court has really lost its confidence from the people, where the people feel that the court is really not interested in their interests, that's a very sad commentary. It may be something that we are seeing endemically in the West these days, where regular people feel that elites are looking out for their own interests more than they are for the interests of the citizenry. And as a number of people have pointed out, the real minority rights that the Supreme Court is embracing is their own self, unelected, small group, unaccountable. They're a minority, and they're going to go to the mat to protect their rights for their own domination.
Anita has asked a question about some attack that took place in the Armenian section of the old city. Can you comment on that? Is that what has happened in this?
I'm not aware. When was this?
Sure, but she's just posed that question. She said there was anti-Israel rhetoric focused on attacks in Armenian in the old.
I'm sorry. I take a pass.
Colin has asked about the fact that the protesters are holding up placards in English. That would suggest that there's an audience they're trying to attract that is not Israeli. Is that the case?
Absolutely, that's the case. And I think that what they're trying to do is to make a connection between what is happening here and buzz terms and associations that people might have in America, in Canada, in England. So yes, I think that that's very much by design. And the idea, look, many American Jews think that Israel is the 51st state, and that's profoundly wrong. It's not the 51st state ethnically. It's not the 51st state ideologically, in terms of where the country is holding. Israel is a center-right society. Right wing is not a dirty word in Israel. It is a compliment in Israel. And most American Jews are appalled to hear that.
Only slightly less in Canada. But in Canada, we have forgiven a prime minister who in his youth did some pretty foolish things, including showing up with blackface, and he's still there, and we haven't pinned him to the wall. So obviously other cultures are forgiving, and you're right about Ben Gvir.
Well, you've given the world Jordan Peterson.
Yes.
So you can be very proud of that.
Right. Goldie asked the question, I think that probably stands with all of us as important, and that is the actual education in Israel about Israel's Jewish rights or the rights to the land. And is that changing? I know Im Tirtzu has worked on that as well.
Well, first of all, Im Tirtzu has been very, very proud to have partnered with Goldie and CILR over the years in such initiatives as Yom San Remo, which is very near and dear to Goldie's heart, and to the, building the awareness of Israel's legal rights. We have a lot of work to do in terms of the education of our youth here in Israel. It is not necessarily a wonderful picture. There's a lot of remedial work that needs to be done. We need to be doing a better job of teaching about Zionist history, about Jewish history, about Jewish peoplehood. And I'm not talking about in religious schools, I'm talking about in our secular schools. There is, we're Jews. There's nothing more important to the Jewish people than education. There's nothing more important than the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. And if we are remiss, and I think we have been remiss here in this country about this, and certainly wildly remiss, frankly, in the diaspora, we've got to do an awful lot more.
Another question's come in about Bibi himself. He has been portrayed, certainly by majority media and the left, as a bully. You mentioned his original focus was, or what he's known for, success in foreign affairs, less so domestically. Will he continue to remain as a problem in bringing about some compromises and peace across the nation? Is that part of the issue that remains?
Well, first of all, I don't know what a bully means. One does not get to be prime minister if you're a milquetoast. I read Bibi's autobiography, which is long, but it's a compelling read. And what you realize is that, I'm I am an admirer of the prime minister, but I have, I think, a realistic sense of his many flaws. But you realize here is a man who grew up like Moshe Rabbeinu. He grew up in the palace. He did not grow up like you and me. He didn't have regular middle-class parents. He grew up in royalty, intellectual Zionist royalty. And he comes to where he's from, where he is, from a very an extraordinary upbringing. His father is a brilliant, brilliant man. His grandfather, brilliant, brilliant man. These were highly impactful people. I think the prime minister is a man of great intelligence. I think he is a man of great conviction. I don't think he's probably the easiest guy to get along with. But you got to hand it to him. He's back. This is his third iteration as prime minister. That's an amazing achievement. He's outstripped even Churchill in this regard. And so, is he a bully? I don't know. But he's clearly has an awareness of what he wants to accomplish and an awareness of what the challenges are of Israel that are unmatched. I mean, when you saw his predecessor, Lapid, trying to handle the Americans, and you see how Bibi handles world leaders, there's no comparison. There's absolutely no comparison. No one in this country can stand on the same plane in terms of international relationships that Netanyahu does.
So that leads me to the question about the EU. You mentioned the EU is funding the building of illegal structures. They have built, I understand from Regavim, from Naomi Khan, who was here in Toronto with us for a week, they've built thousands. I think she's indicated as many as 80,000 illegal structures, which is astonishing. So can Bibi challenge the EU? Can something be done to stop that activity?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, Regavim is a wonderful organization, and they have done yeoman's work over the years. I have great admiration for them in consistently pointing out this reality of illegal construction and the chipping away at the Jewish cohesiveness of Area C, and they deserve all the credit in the world. One of the criticisms of Bibi is that he's not been necessarily that strong on protecting the Jewish interests in Judea and Samaria. He's been more or less dragged into it because, again, take, for example, the Abraham Accords. One of the reasons why the Abraham Accords was seen to be viable is that Bibi dropped any pretense to applying sovereignty over the Jordan Valley or parts of Area C. And this facilitated the Bahrainis and the Emiratis to take the final step and agree to relations. So I think his priority is that. So it remains for, as I said in my remarks, for some of the coalition partners to really buttress him, to push him in this regard in terms of focusing on the interest of the Jewish settlements in Area C.
Well, I want to mention for all of our audience that CAEF is looking to partner with Regavim and other organizations to consider what is the strategy we in the diaspora can use to bring attention to the EU's misappropriation of lands. And actually, I read they've also helped to set up an Arab land registry for Area C, which is unbelievable.
Yeah.
One of the questions that I've been kind of a one-off, but I'm also curious about is someone has asked about Alan Dershowitz, whom we know to be a Democrat, a liberal lawyer, but a very staunch civil rights supporter and someone who really said outright that Bibi Netanyahu did not commit crimes that have been called, for which he's been indicted. These are not real crimes.
Right.
But he has come out against the judicial reforms.
Right,
which surprises some of us.
right.
Can you comment on that? Are these reforms not in line with Americans' judicial system?
Well, first of all, we have different judicial systems. And Israel does not have a written constitution, for example. Israel's selection process of justices involves a veto power given to the Supreme Court justices who sit on its committee. That's something that is wildly different from the American process. The American process, as we all know, is that the president nominates and the Senate confirms. So you have involvement of the executive, the legislature, no involvement by the judiciary. So you have very different selection process here in Israel. The judicial revolution in Israel is put the court in a wildly different posture than the US Supreme Court, which hears 60 to 80 cases a year. The Israeli Supreme Court hears 10,000 cases a year. Many of them are first instance cases. The Israeli Supreme Court, Justice Scalia was wildly critical of the Israeli Supreme Court because Israel had dropped standing, has dropped the idea of judiciability, has adopted a standard of reasonableness that basically says the court can hear whatever case it wants to hear, regardless of anyone bringing the case has any connection to what is being litigated. And so it's a very, very different posture. And I'm not exactly sure what Dershowitz was getting at in terms of, he was sort of, I read a little bit about it. He was sort of ambivalent. He was, I don't really like it. It's not the end of the world. But we are a different system here. And our system is sort of a hodgepodge between the old mandate system, and it doesn't really closely resemble the American system. I would just make one point about these protesters. You have now in America protesters who are standing in front of the houses of US Supreme Court justices, which is really despicable. They don't know much about or care about the Supreme Court per se. What they care about is that you now have a lot of strict constructionist, conservative-leaning justices. This is a power issue, just as it is here. The Supreme Court was the darling of the left when it was the Warren Court in the 60s and the 70s. But now, today, it is anathema to the left. In Israel, if the highly interventionist, highly activist, no bounds Supreme Court of Israel was also very conservative, I guarantee you the left would be calling for its head, just as they are doing in the United States. Again, this is not about jurisprudential issues. This is about, so given your jurisprudential issues, where do you come out? Are you left, you right? Where do you come out? And if the Israeli Supreme Court started to skew right the way the American Supreme Court has, then the left here would have no respect for it whatsoever.
Right. Well, and I read that some of the reforms that are being considered now were actually proposed a decade ago. This is not even a new conversation.
Oh, no, this is not a new thing because this revolution started in 95. We're talking about 27 years of an incremental, not so gradual, but very, almost linear development. This is not a new thing. What's new is the willingness of these parties now in the government to say, must speak, enough. And we're not going to, we've got to finally do something about it. And
Doug,
as I said, go ahead, yes.
No, sorry to interrupt you. I have just one more question on one sector that we didn't talk about, and then I really feel I have to let you go because you've been so good, and it's late there, and you have a bad cold. And that's about the economy. Some of the threats have been really outlandish, suggesting that with these changes, judicial changes, the high-tech companies will leave, the economy will flounder. And I read a statement today of 2 or 3 CEOs that are saying they're taking their companies out. Is that true?
Well, I remember when Trump was elected president of the United States in 2016, about 20% of the country was ready to move to either Canada or Switzerland.
Right.
And I think 4 people left. This is sort of like ringing the alarm bell. I think there's much less to it than meets the eye. I think these are threats. I think this is fear mongering in its purest form. Many CEOs are moving Israeli companies or thinking about it or opening divisions because they need to expand. I mean, I think it's a little bit naive. It's a little bit disingenuous to say we're doing this because of the prospect of, if that's the case, then you have a CEO who doesn't deserve to be in that role. He's not doing the right thing by his company or her company, if that's the posture that they're taking. So I think that this is a little bit of fear-mongering designed to get everyone to say, no, please, don't. Okay, we're just kidding. We're just kidding. And we'll go home. But I don't think people are going to go home.
Well, I can't see the connection between judicial reform and the economy, but I would like to recommend to everyone, if they haven't seen it yet, there's a wonderful interview on YouTube, since you mentioned Jordan Peterson, in which he actually interviews Prime Minister Netanyahu, who explained something I wasn't aware of, which is how the economy expanded beautifully under his
deregulation
direction. Yes, because as he says, capitalism breeds wealth and socialism doesn't. So
right.
See that.
No, there was a big article by a former head of the Bank of Israel, Karnit Flug, who said, look, if you Supreme Court judicial reforms could negatively impact Israel's credit standing. That's what her concern was. Israel has done very, very well in terms of its economy. Its credit rating is very high. And I don't think that there will be a rush to turn Israel into be perceived as a banana republic because of some of these changes that can be very, very logically, compellingly explained and defended. So the prospect is always worse than what the reality will turn out to be. And I think, again, that's fear-mongering. I think it's allies of the court have been pressed into service to say, this will be the end of the world. And it will not be the end of the world. It really will not be the end of the world.
On that note, thank you so much for your time and brilliance. This was a wonderful presentation. I
apologize to everyone for hacking, but I did say I had a cold.
We hope
and Andrea, thank you. You're terrific. Your organization is great. I appreciate the attention of your viewers. I hope that this has been helpful to you. I would love for anyone who wants to learn more about Im Tirtzu to visit us on our website. I think there's a
screen will come up with the website shortly.
Okay,
and
very
thank you
good.
to all of our sponsors who've been great
Yes,
to support us and promote this. So everybody have a good day. Take care. Be well.